I'll start talking.
Excellent. Vamp till ready.
John's going to be my leadoff, John Conroy, and he'll be here in a second. He just had to step away for a second. I'm Maurice Possley. I'm the senior researcher at the National Registry of Exonerations, which I've been doing since 2012 when it went public. Before that, I spent 35 years as a reporter in Chicago, 25 of them at the Chicago Tribune, where I spent about the last 10 years investigating cases of wrongful conviction, as well as systemic problems in the criminal justice system, such as false confessions, prosecutorial misconduct, bad forensics, good forensics, practiced badly. And before the registry went public in 2012, one of the things that Sam Gross, who you heard from this morning, asked me to do was kind of take a look at were there other group exonerations that we didn't know about, because not a whole lot of work had been done at that point in gathering, or at least for a few years. And one of the things that I knew from my experience in Chicago as a reporter was that we had had a number of police scandals involving corrupt officers with drug cases in the Austin district, the Gresham district, and I wasn't really aware of what had ever happened after those officers were indicted and convicted. And so when I started poking around, the answer was pretty much nothing. I found a few cases in Pacer where people had sued, a handful. I spent several weeks trying to pin down the state's attorney's office as to what did you do? And essentially the answer was, well, if there were pending cases, we dismiss those. Well, yeah. What about the convictions? Well, if somebody came to us, we would either tell them to see their lawyer, or if a lawyer came to us, we would look at the case. But there was no attempt to do any sort of deep dive into the cases of these officers. And I found it particularly frustrating to think that as a journalist, I wasn't there or I didn't get on my radar to try to push for that. What we've got here are people today who have done exactly that. And one of the things that I always tried to keep in mind during my work is you're talking about a voiceless people. And one of the things that the media can do is be a voice for the voiceless. We heard Tara talk about being credible, establishing credibility out in the community. Michael Mellon talked about trust, building trust in the community. The reporters here have gone out into the community. They've talked to people, they've listened, and they've written about it with varying degrees of response. And one of the frustrating things that can happen as a journalist is you go out and you come up with a new evidence, or you come up with a great story about some corruption, and you write it, and there's just deafening silence. We can't petition for DNA testing. We can't file post-conviction motions. People have to react to us. And what we'll hear today, we like to say at the registry we do two things. We count things and we tell stories. And today you're going to hear some stories about what happened or not after some of these stories were published. I just want to introduce each person and then we'll take them sort of in order. John Conroy is a senior investigator at the MacArthur Justice Center at Northwestern University, where he works on wrongful conviction and civil rights cases. John was the lone sort of voice in the media wilderness on the torture cases in Chicago. He wrote a book about it. He's written a play about it. He's won numerous awards for it. It took a long time for people like me in the sort of, he wrote for the alternative media, for us in the mainstream to get involved. Melissa Segura is an investigative reporter with Buzzfeed News. Her reporting focuses on the intersection of justice, class, and race. She wrote a groundbreaking series of articles about another infamous detective in Chicago, which she will tell you about. Also, this was a case where I started getting calls on this when I was still at the Tribune, and I left in 2008. And it's been sort of bubbling out there for a long time, and she did some remarkable work on that. Barbara Laker and Wendy Ruderman are investigative reporters well known in this city. They now are at the now merged Philadelphia Inquirer and Daily News, and you saw there were references to their work earlier. They won a 2010 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting for their series Tainted Justice, about some of these bad police officers, one in particular. I sort of said, you guys can figure out how you're going to tag team this, but one of the questions that I want to have is your reaction to the fact, as I was, and I kind of was aware of this because I was reading about it, certainly when I became involved in the registry, and it was a couple years later, in 2012. Kudzik, is that how you pronounce his name?
Chudzik.
Chudzik, okay, got his job back. Okay, amazing. And Mark is the reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer who has worked on numerous projects, also involving the voiceless. Won numerous awards relating to the underreporting of rape and a series on the underreporting of crime. So, and he's written extensively about what Brad Bridge has been doing for the last 2 decades. So I'd like to turn it over to John. And one last thing is, one of the things that coming late in the day, you can kind of build on what other people have said. Listening to the district attorney and then comments that other people have made, you're talking about what is an exoneration and the idea that some of these people may be guilty and we're dismissing the cases. The idea that the stain of justice can be tolerated or is more willing to be, is harder to remove in cases where we have these atrocities, crimes that even a district attorney doesn't want to talk about in public, becomes the pushback in those. Because of those, we're willing to matador thousands of drug cases through without concern about guilt or innocence because of the stain. And why would we tolerate the stain in these others, as painful as it is?
So I'm going to talk about Chicago police torture scandal. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to use the microphone, right? I'm going to talk about the Chicago police torture scandal, which began, dated from 1973, but I'm going to jump to 1992. John Bush is the sort of scandal. He became a police officer at the age of 22, was a detective at the age of 24, and 2 years later started using electric shock. He moved up in 1992. He was acting commander of the Area 2 Violent Crime Unit when 2 police officers were shot dead by Andy Wilson. This is Andy when he arrived at Cook County Jail. And if you look very closely at his nose, you'll see what looked like a little alligator came and bit him. And same thing on his ears and on his chest. He had these parallel burns and this burn on his thigh. And he told his public defenders that he'd been wired up to an electric shock device, hand cranked, and forced up against a hot radiator. So he got the death penalty. The Illinois Supreme Court overturned the case and said the state didn't show his confession was given voluntarily. This is the guy who took the confession, a guy named Barry Hyman, who was a supervisor of the so he took the confessions and producer the document. I think it's probably the side confession you'll ever see that has no voluntariness question in it. He's never asked, are you giving it voluntarily? Have you been coerced into giving this or anything like that? Richard Davis took the time. So it was 1982. He had to, if you're looking for a death penalty, if you're going to ask for a death penalty, you had to get approval from Daley. So in state's attorney's office in 1982, you could not confess without a voluntary. You could not those injuries and not be very concerned what's happening later too. So, life. And in 1989, he started a suit against the police department, and that's where I come in. At the end of that suit, been introduced. He's representing people's lives, and they had covered other evidence of other individuals who had claimed to have been tortured in Area 2. So that was 1990. And for 30 years, if no anything. Until this guy, 4 days on and then it climbed, and that was in large part due to Possley and his comments at the Chicago Tribune's work on the death penalty. So, this guy Hartley, and he sent out written interrogatories, and Bush was a Chicago police officer every year. Form the physical coercion of suspects. How broad a question is that? And said, I'm not aware. So, on the basis of less than 60 weeks, Patrick Fitzgerald indicted in 2008, as the statute of limitations was about to expire for obstruction, because they couldn't get torture charges. So they got suit. In 2000, Bush was convicted. So after he stopped using electric shock points, after it was first exposed, and it's to 4 years. Number 120 some, but truly we really don't know, because there was systematic search. Only one man has been convicted, and that's Bush. The thing that came out of it was a ordinance in May of 2015. I that all credit goes to the community organizers and Joey Mogul at the People's Law Office. It's a remarkable document because it admits the torture committed, including individuals on the genital lips, ears, suffocation, execution, physical beating, phone books, and rubber hoses. And the elements of it basically are the form of specialized counseling services, free to city colleges. This is incredible. School kids in 10th grade are now learning about this scandal because it's part of their required history curriculum. And there's a program on the survivors. Let's do 5.5 provided to living survivors, and 57 got reparations. The top amount you could get was $100,000, and but none of them were exempted. So of all these people, not one of those that I'm pretty sure, Tara, you can correct me later if I'm wrong, has been exempted. Cost in civil litigation is more because the state's attorney presents successively, not just Dave Cecil Partee for a short time, or and after him. So, what's the difference between the cases we've heard about with the great success? Victims were African Americans with criminal accused of not accused of but of torture, and the Chicago public seems to believe with that. State some the police want to and this is a estimate. had it been a small, like some of the scandals that it might have been easy to go after. And if it had been a small number of cases, frankly, it might have. There's no sort of flip. The detectives, some of them who went to work for the state's attorney's office after being retired, they went to work for the sheriff and work for the city's law department. So that would have dragged all of those agencies into the mix. The agency, the professional standard was ineffective. They were forbidden at PAC, so each case had to be viewed in isolation. And the law department didn't track excessive force cases. If you called and said, give me all cases in which Officer Conroy accused of misconduct and sued for it, they couldn't tell you.
I hate to do this, I really do, but this is your life. No, we're not hearing you in the simulcast. Could you go up to there, and I apologize for the batteries. Thank you.
And lastly, judges didn't have the courage to suppress statements or call out cops for perjury. So what's the takeaway from this? For the defense attorneys, I don't know. I think that I'm now part of that community. I'm not an attorney, but I'm an investigator. I think that we are now perceived to be the usual voices, the usual suspects. And I wonder if we had involved white-collar law firms at some level, whether that would have made any difference. Maybe not. I don't know. And you know, a couple of these guys did have white-collar firms. The press response could have been a whole lot better. My coverage was too granular. It took me too long to go up the ladder. I was so focused on the officers, I never thought, wait a minute, what about the state's attorneys? And then what about the judges? So that took way too long. Community involvement was minimal until approximately 2012. Ministers as a group, I'm speaking, were never involved. Amnesty International came very early, but went, and the city council gave it no more than cursory attention periodically. So if you want rapid change, I wonder if your primary audience isn't limited to the state's attorney, the state attorney general, the governor, and the DOJ. And so, and I also wonder, we had a case in Illinois of a appellate attorney who looked at a case in DuPage County and said, I'm not going to prosecute this. This is a wrongful conviction. And she went to her boss and said, we should not prosecute this case. And she was forced to retire. But I wonder if there couldn't have been some effort to reach a line prosecutor and say, come on, you know, or the appellate attorney who handled so many of these. What are you doing? You know, time after time you see the same cops and you, in good conscience, continue. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Let's segue into Melissa.
Okay. Hello, thanks for having me.
While we're in Chicago.
While we're in Chicago. Yes, the irony, of course, is that I don't live in Chicago. I just report from there. But in sum, for the past 3 years, I have been reporting exclusively. I actually have, I think, like keyboard shortcuts to the name Ronaldo Guevara on my computer. And for the last 3 years, I have been reporting. It started out, like Tara said, a lot of times the community knows what's going on. This was no big secret around Chicago, or particularly around the neighborhood, Humboldt Park. They knew, and they constantly repeated, hey, there's a problem with this particular officer and his partners and the entire Area 5 police station. So I was just an interloper, quite honestly. The story started sort of in a peculiar way. The most logical place, of course, it could start was on a football field in San Juan Capistrano. I was a sports reporter before this, and I happened to be speaking with an attorney who was representing a football player who had been exonerated, and he started telling me about other cases he was working on. And this particular attorney said, hey, for the past 20 years, I have been leaving my home in San Diego and traveling back to Chicago to represent this one particular woman in a case, and she had pleaded out and gotten the death penalty. it's the only case that we can ever, that I've been able to find, or he was able to find, where the plea agreement was death. So we'll go for that. And that was one peculiarity, and that's what I thought, hey, I'm really curious about this case. But the other thing that struck me is that this was something that this particular attorney, his name is Justin Brooks, the director of the California Innocence Project, had been working on his own time, on his own dime for the past 20 years. And at that point, I was so naive, and I didn't realize that an exoneration actually could take that long. And so I was really curious about this, but I was, busy writing Major League Baseball stuff. And when I was laid off, because as we all know, the media culture and the economy isn't the strongest, I was actually looking to go to law school, and I was thinking, well, how do I kill a year before law school admissions? And there was an opportunity for Buzzfeed News, which is primarily known to most of you either not at all, or for quizzes about which Disney princess you might be, or cat videos. And the good news about that, though, about those Disney princess quizzes and those cat videos, is it provided a lot of revenue for us. And that's definitely a peculiarity and an abnormality within the media culture today. And what does that mean? That means that BuzzFeed was able to bring me in and hire me and let me look at, if they gave me the most valuable resource probably that anybody in this room, I think we could all agree, is time. And it allowed me to just focus what I thought was going to be this one particular case about a woman who pleaded guilty to death, right? But it turns out that the main detective on her case was a man by the name of Reynaldo Guevara. And I wish I could say it was some sort of feat of investigative reporting, but I actually typed his name into Google and saw that there were some other instances. There was a case in, I think it was 2008, where a settlement had been issued, which was the largest, I think, award that had been granted by a federal jury to a man named Juan Johnson, who had also accused the detective of misconduct in this particular case. And then I also found cash documents that linked back to old union message boards, literally the old school message boards from Yahoo back in the day that said, hey, this is going on. And that was what was available. And I thought, hey, there are a couple of instances. But when I actually sat down and started and received the fellowship at BuzzFeed, it just became this yarn that I just kept pulling and pulling at and pulling at. And I was fortunate enough that both Northwestern was able to provide me with public records, and they had already started accumulating names, and I was able to start looking at those cases. But the big, I ended up finding about more than 50 cases of misconduct related to Detective Guevara, and a lot of that came from knocking on doors in the community. As Tara had said earlier, there were very bright, capable women in Humboldt Park who would come together initially to be able to support each other and talk about the agony of having their loved one wrongfully convicted. But instead what they found is they actually started a spreadsheet in delineating the different types of pattern and practice that we now know today. So in thinking about what might actually be useful to you, instead of, you can go back, we could read the stories, anything you want to know about the particular cases, I'm happy to share with you about. But I was thinking that a lot of times that you might be more curious, what might be more useful is what's my process here, what are we looking for, and how you might be able to use the press. And I guess foundationally it might be to understand what I might do in a particular case like this. So of course this story, as I mentioned, started in the same way that all great stories, and that's that somebody told me something, right? And it wasn't just that he told me, hey, I've got this injustice, and it was interesting, and of course, the facets of the case are sometimes enough to be able to justify a story. But in many cases, and I spoke with some of my colleagues who also do criminal justice reporting, is that we're looking for cases that are reflective of larger patterns or trends. They could be precedent-setting cases, they could be things, but for me, obviously, Detective Guevara had a pattern. It involved so many people in the community that, of course, we couldn't ignore it. So that's one thing. I'm definitely looking for things that are reflective of just those larger trends. So when I've identified a case that might be that, or a story that we might be interested in looking at, the next thing I'll do is I'll look, this is me personally, my process, is I'll take any and every document that I can get my hands on. And particularly with innocence cases, or quote-unquote innocence cases, I'm actually not reading the case to see if your client is innocent. I am trying every which direction to find your client guilty, because that's really the only way that I know that he or she might actually be innocent. It's a methodology I actually learned from an inmate by the name of Antonio McDowell, who told me I was stupid for like asking him why he was innocent. This is like my first week on the job. I'm like, so why are you innocent? He's like, that is not how you do it. And he is absolutely right. So that is the first thing that I'll do, and then I'm fortunate again to have lots of time. So then I'll do like a second pass and try and see what are the other like sort of tenets of innocence that there might be, or misconduct, or that kind of thing. And so this is where a lot of times, particularly I can say, I think for local press right now, whose resources are extremely limited, both in terms of finances, that kind of thing, if you have documents that you're able to provide and ship to me via PDF, Dropbox, whatever, please do it, because that's definitely, I think, of service to newsrooms that are limited. For me, again, I work for a national outlet, and I don't live in the community, so I can't always run over to Cook County, and as you guys from Chicago can verify, it's not exactly a digital operation there. So if you're able to provide those documents. The other thing is there might be a case that might be super sensitive, and you don't want to have like you don't want your fingerprints on this case in any way. What you might be able to do if you're litigating a case is enter them in as exhibits, and then they're publicly available, and it's a way of perhaps creating distance for you in those particular cases. So please, documents are my very, very best friend. And then so the next thing, after I've reviewed everything that I possibly can in a case file, is I pick and I make a list of every single person who is mentioned, the name of the dog of the person who was mentioned, and I try to find every single person I can. Now this is where I think one of two things happens. Number one, the lawyer is scared to death, like what are you gonna do? You're gonna completely mess up my case if you talk to this witness. I understand that concern, but this is, I think, where we sort of diverge. Like, my job is not to represent your client, my job is to find the truth. And sometimes these things can be at odds. Having said that, though, if there is actually, I'm not a jackass, so if there actually is a reason why you're thinking, well, if you can explain to me that if I can hold off on this interview for 3 weeks or whatever it might be, that does not in any way, I think, jeopardize the truth and integrity of my journalistic enterprise, I mean, we can have a conversation about that. And then the other reaction that I get, which sometimes is a little bit more troubling, is you guys are like, yes, you're going to go do interviews, and you're going to tell me everything that happened. I can't do that. Like, I'm not your investigator, and if I do that, I jeopardize my own position and the standing with Shield Law. So I can't tell you how many times I've been said, like, hey, what did they say? What happened? I'm not being a jerk. I cannot tell you. I'm sorry if you're not able to find or establish the same kind of relationships, but again, I'm not being mean. I cannot tell you what sort of the fruits of that particular labor. The other thing, so what happens after that? Then what happens is I start annoying you to death because I'm calling you over and over and over again as I'm writing the story. And of course I'm going to make a mistake, and I don't want to do that. My editors are going to edit it, and they're going to put in things that aren't true, and I'm going to have to go back and fix it again. And I'm going to have to go over the facts over and over and over, and if you answer the phone, that's really, really helpful to me. And I'm sure to the other reporters here. And then just as soon as you think that, like, hey, the story's out now and you are done with me, you're not, because this is actually something I learned from Buzzfeed, and I didn't want to do it, but the follow-up story, so I had like a big day one story that came out that sort of laid out the basics of what was happening with Detective Girard. I wanted to go on vacation on that, the day after publication, and instead my bosses were telling me, no, it's the day 2, it's the day 3, it's the day 10 story that a lot of times helps to generate the public conversation and create the pressure needed to be able to pursue whatever justice might be in that particular case. And I'm just trying to think. And there's also a difference, this is the big thing that I guess if I could tell you, is sometimes I'm going to have to ask you or your client very difficult questions. And for me, it's not an adversarial relationship. I'm just trying to find out what the truth is going to be. And the other thing is a lot of times there will be people who want to hide the ball from me and say, like, oh, they don't want to show me everything, I'm going to find out anyway, and it might actually jeopardize the relationship that we build and the trust that I can have with you if you're trying to hide the ball from me. I'm going to read it and I'm going to find it, so it would just be better sometimes if you're forthright with me about, sort of the dynamics of the case. And I think that just about takes up my time.
Take it away.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
I would urge anyone you can easily Google these two reporters and find their work from 2009. And you're talking about the rolling story.
Okay.
Which is a story engenders another story engenders another story. It was incredible reporting. I mean,
Oh, thank you.
Really.
Yeah, so we're just going to wing it. We're not going to be as polished as Melissa and John. We're just going to pull it right out of our butts. But we can echo a lot of what's been said here, that that the follow-up stories or the rolling investigation in our case, if you keep going and keep pulling the string, and even if people are calling and threatening you or saying they're going to cancel the newspaper, or they're just going to wish you dead or whatever it is, you just got to keep on going and push through it, because the end result, even though in our case our officers, they were internally disciplined, but one of them did get fired. They all ended up keeping their jobs. They're all still on the force, which obviously Barbara and I have a strong opinion about that. But police officers have an incredible amount of power, as you all know, and so do prosecutors. But I would argue that reporters have sometimes just as great of power, and we need to wield it carefully. But we're lucky in the sense that we are not prosecutors and we are not police officers, and we do not. We have rules and we have standards, but they're different than the legal standards that you might apply. But that gives us more freedom to shed light and bring heat into darkness. So always the best disinfectant sometimes is the press. And I think that a lot of really good police officers and lawyers know that, because there is a system in place to monitor police officers and to track their behavior, but we find in Philadelphia that it's such an incestuous community among the police officers that a lot of the police officers in internal affairs have a very difficult time doing their jobs. Police officers feel like if they go to internal affairs, they might as well just stand on the corner with a bullhorn and tell everybody that they're lodging a complaint about whatever, their partner stealing money or stealing drugs or lying on search warrants. And so sometimes it is easier for that police officer to make a quiet call to reporters like myself and Barbara. And I think that when the system doesn't work for reasons of nepotism and fear, reporters can be very helpful in bringing light to things. And so our story started when a drug informant named Benny Martinez, he had actually gone and complained about, he was working with a police officer named Jeffrey Chuddick. They had worked together for 7 years, and they were basically lying on search warrants to get into people's homes and arrest them for drugs. Now, some of the people that they did arrest, even though they didn't do it the right way, were drug dealers. But some of them were not. And I think that Barbara and I believed very firmly in the fact that if you're a police officer, you can't bend the law to enforce the law. You just can't do that, just the way we can't make up quotes, because the whole foundation of things will just fall apart. The entire establishment and democracy begins to crumble. So we felt really strongly about that. When this drug informant came to us and said that he and this officer had been working together and they were lying on these search warrants, of course it was to believe him. I mean, I think that part of what we're all talking about here is that people who become victims in whichever way, whether they're arrested and falsely charged, or a confession is beaten out of them. It's because people aren't going to believe them. They're not the kind of people with a lot of power. They're largely minorities. Maybe they don't speak English very well. They're poor. They don't have the resources. So, like, Benny's one of these people. I mean, he had a very shady record, to put it mildly. I mean, that's why he was a drug informant, duh. But he came to us and he started telling us this story that he wanted to turn on this police officer he'd been working with. And we had a lot of help from police officers, but we also had a lot of help from attorneys, and one of them is Bradley Bridge, who had helped organize this great event. But he happened to tell us, I called him and I asked him, do you know how I can get access to search warrants in Philadelphia? In Pennsylvania, the records laws are just terrible. They're awful. And reporters just hate. I mean, Philadelphia is a great place to be a reporter because you're always going to find some story not to be believed but ends up being true. But the open public records laws are just atrocious. And so Bradley had told me and Barbara about this obscure room on the 4th floor of the Criminal Justice Center in Philadelphia. It was like a little broom closet. It was like a closet, and it had stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of these search warrants that were very old-fashioned, typed out in onion skin layers, and the whole system. None of them were in order. They were just piles and piles of them everywhere. And this was Philadelphia's justice system, how it worked in 2008, 2009. And so Bradley told us about this room, and we just knew we had to get into this room. And we did, because we're persistent, pesky little buggers, and what we ended up doing was we pulled all of the search warrants with this police officer's badge number on it, and then we just split them up and went door to door to door to door. And I mean, some of it was the drug dealers would say, well, I know you're lying because this is the drug I sell. I don't sell this kind of drug. I sell my Coke has a skull and crossbones on it, and this is heroin with the smiley face, and that belongs to that guy down the road, or whatever. So, but I think there's other ways of corroborating the story about the relationship between this drug informant and this police officer. But one thing we noticed in going through the search warrants is all of the big-time bosses that worked with this particular officer and worked in this particular narcotics squad at one point. So John McNesby, who's head of the Fraternal Order of Police and absolutely despises us, and we're like, yeah. His name showed up quite a bit on these search warrants. He had worked a long time with all of these officers. He knew where all the bodies were buried, and it just went on like that up the chain of command. So everybody kind of knew what's going on. So anyway, we ended up, the first story that we wrote, we literally sat down with our attorneys for the paper at the time, and they were like, you have a 50-50 chance of getting sued here because, this is difficult. And my boss said to me, Michael Days, he said, do you believe him? Do you believe him? And I said, I do. I believe him. And then he said, let's just go with the story then. And we did go with the story. And everybody hated us after that because, there's a big population who believes that it doesn't matter how you do it, just get it done. I think John was talking about that, how there's a certain tolerance for lying to arrest drug dealers. No matter how you do it, let's do it. But we felt firmly it was a slippery slope, and so we just kept on at it. And I'll let Barbara talk to you a little bit about where the story went from there. But police officers and attorneys like Bradley Bridge were super helpful to bringing light to a story where the system just wasn't working, the system to catch bad cops.
So after the story ran, the FOP had a giant press conference, and we didn't know exactly what it was about until we showed up. And it was basically an attack on Wendy and myself, saying that we were liars and we relied on a liar, the drug informant, to tell the story about this decorated officer who was like a pillar of the community. And then one of I think it was McNesby, who got up and he said, the only thing lower than a drug informant is a Daily News reporter. And he was pointing at both of us.
They were all clapping.
Yeah. And then the cameras went around and ended up on Wendy and myself. But then what happened shortly after that, is after that huge attack, is we got a call from an attorney in Philadelphia who said, you know that squad you're writing about? Well, I have a client who has a bodega, a little corner store in Philadelphia. He was raided by that same squad, and they came in and they smashed the video surveillance cameras, cut the wires, and looted his store. And do you want to talk to him, the lawyer asked Wendy, because he called Wendy. And so she said, of course. So she ran over to the attorney's office, and the client, a Jordanian man, had decided he was too scared to talk. He didn't want to talk. So, but what we had remembered from being in that search warrant room is that this squad, above any other squad in Philadelphia, raided dozens of these corner bodega stores. So we went back to the search warrant room and we pulled every single warrant and every single store or business that this squad had raided. And then we split them up, and there were lots of them. We split them up, and then we either went out to the store or tracked them down, because some of them had lost their stores since this had happened. And an amazing thing happened. They were from all parts of the world, Korean, Jordanian, Dominican, from everywhere. They spoke all different languages. They were all here legally. They all worked very long hours, from like 7 in the morning till 10 at night. We were very careful not to ask any leading questions. We just said, remember when your store was raided and blah, blah. Tell us what happened during that raid. Every single one of them, and they didn't know each other, told us the exact same story, that this squad came in and they weren't in uniform. Some of them would have like police on their back, but when they're storming through the store, all you see is a blue shirt with guns drawn, and they went up to these immigrants, put a gun to their head, and asked them, they wanted to know if they had these little baggies that can be used for drugs, and they were going to charge them with drug paraphernalia. But during the raid, as soon as they walked in there, they were fixated on the video surveillance cameras and the wires going into the cameras. And they smashed the cameras, cut the wires. One Korean woman was so scared she thought she was being robbed by armed robbers and peed in her pants. And then after the cameras went dark, they looted the store. All these immigrants dealt in cash. They were scared they didn't trust banks in their foreign country or the police or government, so they all dealt in cash. They paid their rent in cash. They paid for all their merchandise in cash, so they would have thousands in the store. The police officers took all the money, or most of the money that they had in the store. They would write down on the property receipt that like a fraction of what they actually had in the store. And then they would help themselves to sandwiches in the deli, drinks in the fridge. They swiped their hands across the shelves, so all their merchandise went on the floor. Some of the stores had lottery, so they had lottery money, and they left the stores in shambles and left. In the beginning, I mean, Wendy and I were like, we couldn't believe that this was happening, and it had been happening for like 2 years, that this had been going on unchecked, like only this squad was doing this. And at first, the few people we had talked to in the beginning, they were too scared to go on the record. They hadn't told anyone about this. And so Wendy and I had a pact that if we were going to tell this story, we had to have these store owners on the record. You can't have people who are accusing police officers of being criminals without the people being on the record. So we kept going and going and going. For the first story, we ended up finding 16 merchants who all told us the very similar story about what happened in their stores. So then we circled back to every single merchant who we'd originally talked to and said, look, you're not alone. We've actually found 15 other store owners who say the exact same thing. Would you be willing to go on the record? And every single one of them did. And a lot of them did photos for us. They were very courageous to do what they did and come forward like that. But we believe that they finally felt empowered. They felt like they had a group of them together. After the series ran, we got word of more and more store owners that had been robbed by this squad, and in the end, we found 22 store owners that this had happened to. Many of them, well, all of them were charged with misdemeanors. They had to pay lawyers for court costs. Some of them lost their stores. And and then later, after we ran the series, it was even worse than we thought. We talked to another drug informant, not Benny, and the cops in this squad had actually used this drug informant to go around the city and case out the stores that they were going to rob, because they wanted people who didn't speak English. They wanted people who they didn't think would be like the angry merchant who would like storm into the DA's office or internal affairs, and none of them did. And they wanted a lot of the merchants we both talked to were meek. They worked from 7 in the morning till 10 at night. They didn't have another life. They were scared they were going to lose their livelihood. A lot of them did. And then after that story ran, the critics kind of went away. They were very quiet. And then we got another call from another store owner, Jose, who said, that the stores that you're writing about, he said, well, that happened to me. And he was a Dominican guy who didn't speak English very well, but he had a backup video surveillance system when they had come into the store. The cops didn't know that. So, and it had audio and visual on the tape. So he said, you can come on over. He said, I have the tape. And we actually took because we wanted a police officer to tell us whether this looked like okay, kosher, whether it didn't look okay, because we didn't know. So to make a long story short, we took a police officer to this man's house. And he worked
in a different narcotics squad. We hit him in the back of my car, and he laid down as we drove out of the city.
In our PT Cruiser.
Yeah. It was pretty funny, but he was a longtime narcotics officer.
And so we went to Jose's house, and finally he got the tape to roll. And it was like a really weird moment, because there's this merchant there who can't speak much English, and their narcotics officer, and they see on the screen how the cops are saying, how many eyes does the camera have, and can you see it at home? And then you can see them step onto a milk carton and they take a deli knife from the deli and slash the wires, and they're both looking at each other like, oh my God, can you believe this? And they're having a moment together.
Yeah, the police officer, and then he was like, can you believe them?
Yeah.
Because they're looking at the money in the drawer, and then looking up at the camera and trying to figure out, and they're openly talking about it. And the narcotics officer who's watching this with us at the dining room table goes like, these cops are in so much effing trouble. And then Dominican goes, yeah, I know. And then we went to Applebee's afterwards.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's it.
So, the FBI did an investigation on this whole squad. The cops were never criminally charged with the bodega robberies. We heard that part of the problem was all the store owners dealt in cash. It wasn't like robbing a Wawa. And there was a language barrier, and some merchants had asked for translators and never got them. The one good thing that came out of this is the merchants did feel like that they were able to tell the city and the country what had happened to them, and that squad is not, or any squad as far as we know, is not doing that anymore. But they were not locked up for that.
Thank you. Mark.
Well, I'm going to try and give a little more perspective, jumping over before your story ran and after your story ran. And that's because Philadelphia, almost every decade, has had a police scandal. And there are some reasons for that recurrence. But I started writing intensely about police corruption in 1995 when 5 officers were indicted. And it was a federal case. I did simple things there that reporters do. I tried to contact the people that were listed in the indictment. I contacted Bradley Bridge from the defender's office because he was filing post-conviction relief motions. And the question was always, who was most sympathetic? Because we know a lot of these people, store owners apart, but a lot of the defendants that were being arrested were problematic people. So What we also know is they didn't get fair trials because their attorneys either did not know about what these officers were doing or did not use that information. So the early stories, in the early stories, one of the first people I found was well, her name is Reverend Betty Patterson, very religious woman, and she was arrested by these 5 officers because they wanted to get one of her relatives, and they were going to use her to pressure the relative. So she spent 3 years in prison. They testified against her, won a conviction, and the city would eventually pay $1 million to her for the time she spent in prison. After the indictment of the police officers, 3 of them talked with me. And they said that they were under great pressure from their supervisors to produce a lot of arrests. It was a time when the crack epidemic was really hitting the city. So they said they had a simple solution. They simply abandoned the Constitution. There was no reason to have probable cause. They would stop people in their district, and this is just a precinct scandal, and anyone standing on the corners that they suspected, almost always black men, was patted down. If they found drugs, then they would invent the probable cause. Very simple way they put together cases. When they raided houses, it became more of a fantasy. They would consistently say they'd sent an informant in who had done a buy. The money was passed through a mail slot, and the drugs came out of the mail slot, and then they had to go in and break down the door. So that worked for quite a while until another public defender confronted them in court and said, "You've have quite a pattern of finding these drugs coming through the mail slots." So the officers said they had a solution to that. With that defense attorney, they would never go to court, and the cases would just vanish, and they could continue the same thing. The testimony was always the same, and by appearing only in cases that they thought they could win, they did. None of their superiors questioned them. There is some promise in Philadelphia because with these 5 officers, about 300 cases were thrown out through the public defender filing PCRAs. But there's a real basic theme that we're seeing here. Most of your officers were white. All the officers, 4 of the 5 officers in the 95 case were white. The only non-white was an Asian guy who told me, I never gave a ticket to a white guy. And that was the mindset of these police. We can fast forward from that 95 scandal into the scandal that started in 2012. Again, now we're in the current decade. This time we have a tipster calling me and saying that 5 officers have been transferred, actually 6 officers were transferred from the narcotics squad. So again, I called the public defender and I asked, what do you know about the 6 officers? And I was told that their cases are being pulled by prosecutors. They're being withdrawn by prosecutors. And just with those 2 interviews, it was obvious that we were into another decade of police scandals. And we were able to confront the police commanders and say, you know, what's going on here? And they quickly said, well, it's cops for robbers again. So for me, it's just, I'm back to the same routine. It's story after story about police corruption. But these guys were different because they were from the city narcotics squad. So instead of stealing $100 or a few $100 like the 95 guys, these guys were accused of stealing thousands of dollars. And in one recent case, somewhere in around $100,000, just in a single raid. So it gives you an idea of the amount of temptation that's out there. The feds charged 7 officers in conspiracy. One of them pleaded guilty. His name is Jeffrey Walker. He has been talking to defense attorneys, helping also talking to plaintiffs' attorneys, helping in lawsuits. He's doing this, he says, because his sister was a cop and she died of cancer, and that was his promise to her. So the Public Defender's Office now has filed, maybe 1,000 PCRAs against, for overturning cases here. So that's where we're different from Chicago. We actually have an extraordinarily, 2,000, okay, a very extraordinary Public Defender's Office that has been able to achieve enormous success with PCRAs. So the stories are going to continue. I've now started working on some stories about a prison rapper, Meek Mills. And one of Jeffrey Walker's cohorts, according to Walker and the staffs, was the officer who arrested Meek Mill. So that is a whole source of stories because he has the money to work with investigators and he has support from a record company, and that money is going to go into challenging the Justice Department. These cops were also involved in federal cases, and so the stain of the corruption is going there to a system that prided itself on integrity. Obviously, the stories continue. Lawsuits are going to continue, and settlements are going to be big. The city has set aside $8 million for this scandal, but it keeps broadening. The downside is I don't see any solution being offered by politicians. I don't know where this is going. There's going to be a lot more pressure from different angles, so perhaps we'll see this. We have a reformist district attorney who has already indicted one cop in, the first 4 months in office, so there's some promise here. And I guess on that, I'll leave this with a positive tone, a slightly positive tone.
I know we've almost taken up all of our time. I think, I would like to take a couple of questions, but I think 2 takeaways for sure. As far as you think the tentacles go, they probably go farther. And how much work it takes, and certainly Brad has talked about that, Josh knows that from what he's become involved with in the last couple of years, the enormous amount of work it takes to follow up these, especially when you're looking at the daunting pile of hundreds, thousands of cases. But until I think that's really addressed, and I think John talked about it, the DAs have to step up. It's going to continue to be an enormous problem because it's going to be seen as tolerated. Yes?
Quick question. I have so much in common with you and everyone else because my second career I got here at Philadelphia, became a lawyer. Before that, I was an investigative reporter at Channel 6 here in Philadelphia. I also became a weatherman, but that doesn't matter. My question for you is, I'm curious, the percentage of people who break the law out of all the normal people, and compare that to the percentage of police officers and other professionals who break the law. What are the numbers that you
Whatever number I would guess would be an understatement. That's my skeptical view. I've never seen a number like that. I don't know how you would do that, because we're all human. There's,
The reason I ask is because it does sound like a lot of the people who are arrested didn't really break the law, but it also sounds like a lot of people who aren't arrested, who might be professional people, might be breaking the law. That's why I'm wondering, how bad do you think this is in those officers?
Take a flyer.
What's that?
Take a flyer.
I mean, I think that when police officers break the law, that it's just a completely different thing. I mean, I don't know how you would even compare. I guess, are you talking about like a white collar criminal? I think in all walks of life, if you could get away with something, I remember my dad would have us sneak into like Great Adventure and stuff. I mean, people want to get away with things, and so I just think that you can't. I think with police officers or people who are sworn to uphold the law and have so much power, they have to be held to a higher standard than just your average Joe who, is maybe, I don't know, a different sort of public servant who just takes cat food out on their shopping cart underneath at the Target and doesn't tell anyone, kind of thing. Not that I've ever done that. I really haven't. I swear I don't have a cat. But you know what I'm saying? Like, I just don't see the connection. I might not be understanding.
Well, I also think that there's a tolerance involved too. In Chicago, we used to say, everybody wants the system to be fair until they get pulled over.
Yeah, right.
And then, can I get my case taken care of? Barry.
I'm very taken with John Conroy's initial remarks about lessons learned, right? So one of the things, John, you said, looking back, both for even the lawyers, bringing more than just the usual suspects, but also the press to aim higher, right? So we have the most progressive district attorney in the United States coming in here and saying that he's going to do everything he can. But one should not be naive in believing that he can do it alone. I mean, if I'm the press, I have to start looking at the Attorney General, I have to start looking at the mayor, and I know this sounds completely insane, given the present state of our politics. But if you can imagine 2021, right? I mean, it is really the proper function of the U.S. Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division to prosecute prosecutors who violate the law, just as they're entitled to prosecute police officers. And one thing that most people don't know, but Eric Sussman can tell you, is that the statute of limitations for the U.S. Department of Justice, and Peter and I have experienced this for a long time, on a lot of these bad acts, runs 5 years from the time of the act, not 5 years from discovery, except if the constitutional violation results in death. And so
Barry, of all places, they've already done that in Philadelphia. Just 2 years ago.
But my real point here is that it's got to be, you've got to think really big in terms of how you get all the stakeholders together to look at this. Because, as Mark said, I can't, in New York City, if you go back and you read the Mullen Commission report, you read the Knapp Commission report, there'll be another report soon. It all reads the same, doesn't it? So it has got to be some major structural reaction that really is going to take care of this. And I actually think that, a lot of it, we have to really look at policing professionals and take some leads from them, because When you ask how many officers do this, our experience is, it's that, just as you talked about in Chicago, when a homicide unit or a particular area, if you want to call it, or a precinct goes bad, right, they all go bad, because they're not going to give them up. And so, it's just, you read the Mullen Commission report in New York about our police officers in the late 80s, early 90s. It starts from not disciplining people when they falsify police reports about the smallest thing. That's why I thought it was pretty good that they convicted that cop in Queens the other week for doing that, because that is the only way. If it becomes clear that these people will pay a penalty, you have structures in place, maybe that will change it.
I think we're out of time. Thank you very much.